Hollywood once let Dorothy Dandridge stand close enough to touch history, but not close enough to own it. In 1955, she became the first Black woman ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The film was Time's Carmen Jones. The image was unforgettable. Dorothy Dandridge, glamorous, magnetic, impossible to ignore, walking into a room that had never truly been built for a woman like her. For one brief moment, it looked as if Hollywood had opened a door. But the door did not open all the way. Because the same industry that could celebrate Dorothy Dandridge as a breakthrough still hesitated when the story asked her to be loved by a white man on screen. The same industry that could sell her beauty, her voice, her presence, her danger, her elegance, still could not imagine her as a leading lady with the same freedom given to white actresses around her. That is the wound at the center of her story. Not that Hollywood failed to see Dorothy Dandridge. It saw her. It saw the face. It saw the talent. It saw the camera loved her. It saw that audiences could not look away. And then, after seeing all of that, Hollywood still stepped back. Dorothy Dandridge did not simply live the tragedy of being ignored. Her tragedy was colder than that. She was recognized, praised, photographed, nominated, placed under lights, and turned into a symbol of progress before she was allowed to have the ordinary power of a star. The power to choose, the power to continue, the power to be more than the exception. In Time's Carmen Jones, she burned across the screen with a kind of confidence Hollywood had rarely allowed a Black woman to carry. She was not written as background. She was not there to decorate someone else's story. She was the center of desire, conflict, danger, and attention. That alone was historic. But history can be a beautiful cage. After Time's Carmen Jones, Dorothy should have been offered the kind of roles that follow an Oscar nomination: complex women, romantic leads, prestige dramas, parts that let a performer deepen instead of repeat herself. But Dorothy Dandridge was not working inside a normal star system. She was working inside a system that could admire a Black woman as a sensation, but not trust her as a future. Hollywood wanted her close enough to prove it was changing, not close enough to actually change. And the clearest symbol of that fear was intimacy. A look across a room could be allowed. A suggestion could be allowed. Attention could be marketed. But a kiss, especially a kiss that crossed the racial line America had spent generations policing, was something else. That was not just romance on a screen. To many people at the time, it was a threat. It exposed the border Dorothy Dandridge kept being pushed against. She could be desired, but only within limits. She could be glamorous, but only if the glamour did not disturb the racial order. She could make history, but she could not be permitted to move through Hollywood as if history had truly changed. That is why her story is not a simple rise and fall. It is not only the story of a gifted performer who became famous and then suffered. It is the story of a woman who reached the edge of a future the industry was not brave enough to build. And in that space between recognition and refusal, Dorothy Dandridge spent the rest of her career trying to survive. The public saw the gowns, the photographs, the nightclub stages, the movie posters, the elegance. But behind that image was a woman forced to live inside a contradiction almost impossible to carry. She was famous enough to be called a breakthrough, but not free enough to be treated like one. Every triumph came with a shadow. Her Oscar nomination made her immortal in Hollywood history, but it did not protect her from the old rules. Her beauty made her marketable, but it also made Hollywood afraid of what her beauty meant when placed too close to whiteness. Her talent made her undeniable, but being undeniable was not the same as being allowed. And that is where the story begins. Not with a child born into show business, not with a simple timeline of films and dates, not with the tragic ending people often rush toward. It begins with the moment Hollywood looked at Dorothy Dandridge and saw everything it claimed to admire: beauty, talent, discipline, star power, and still found reasons to hold her back. Because Dorothy Dandridge was not missing the qualities of a leading lady, Hollywood was missing the courage to let her be one. And before the closed doors, before the fading offers, before the lonely rooms in the final years, there was the image the world was first asked to believe in: Dorothy Dandridge as the woman who had finally arrived. To understand why that image broke, we have to look at how carefully it was built. Before Dorothy Dandridge became a name attached to history, she became something even more dangerous in Hollywood. She became visible, not just present, not just talented. Visible, there is a difference. Hollywood had always known how to use black performers when it wanted music, movement, atmosphere, humor, or spectacle. It knew how to place them in a number, how to frame them at the edge of a larger story, how to borrow their talent without changing the shape of the industry around them. But Dorothy Dandridge did not look like someone who belonged at the edge. On screen, she pulled focus. She had the kind of beauty old Hollywood understood instantly, sculpted, controlled, elegant under pressure. But there was something else in her presence, something less convenient. Dorothy did not simply glow for the camera. She challenged it. She made the frame feel smaller than she was. That was part of her power, and part of the problem. By the time Carmen Jones times arrived, Dorothy Dandridge had already learned how to perform inside rooms that were never neutral. Stages could applaud her and still restrict her. Audiences could admire her and still return to the same segregated world outside. Glamour, for a black woman in that era, was never just glamour. It had to pass through rules that white stars did not have to think about. That is what made Dorothy's public image so complicated. To the audience, she could look effortless. The gowns, the cheekbones, the controlled smile, the voice trained for performance, the confidence of a woman who seemed born for the spotlight. But effortlessness is often the most expensive illusion. Dorothy had to appear polished without seeming unreachable, sensual without being allowed the full freedom of romance, strong without being permitted the full range of power, desirable without disturbing the audience that wanted to decide who had the right to desire her. Hollywood could sell her as extraordinary. It was the ordinary things it denied her. A white leading lady could be complicated. She could be soft, cruel, foolish, romantic, unstable, redeemed, ruined, adored. She could fail in one film and return in another. She could age into new kinds of roles. She could be given a career with chapters. Dorothy Dandridge was given a breakthrough, and then she was expected to live inside it. Carmen Jones times made that breakthrough impossible to ignore. The film placed her at the center, not as a servant, not as a comic shadow, not as a singer passing through someone else's dream. She was Carmen, alluring, restless, dangerous, alive. The story revolved around her. Men watched her. The camera watched her. The audience watched her. For a black woman in 1950s Hollywood, that kind of centrality mattered. It was not just a role. It was a challenge to the imagination of the industry. Dorothy proved that a black actress could carry glamour, heat, drama, and command in the same frame. She proved that the camera did not need to shrink her. She proved that audiences could follow her not as a novelty, but as the emotional engine of a film. And then came the contradiction. Even in a role that made her immortal, Hollywood still controlled how much of Dorothy it was willing to release. The singing voice in Carmen Jones times was not hers in the final film. It was dubbed. That fact does not erase her performance. If anything, it sharpens the contradiction. Dorothy Dandridge could carry the image, the face, the body, the fire, the danger, yet the system still shaped and adjusted her, still decided what parts of her were acceptable for the final version. She was being presented as a star, but not entirely on her own terms. That is the first crack in the image. Not a collapse. Not yet. Just a hairline fracture. From the outside, Carmen Jones times looked like a rival. And in many ways, it was. It gave Dorothy a place in Oscar history. It gave her a kind of visibility no black actress had been granted in that category before. It gave her name a permanence Hollywood could not take back. But an arrival is only real if there is somewhere to go afterward. And after Dorothy Dandridge arrived, the road ahead did not widen. It narrowed. That is what makes her story different from the usual legend of a star destroyed by fame. Fame did not simply overwhelm Dorothy. Fame revealed the boundaries around her. The higher she rose, the clearer those boundaries became. For a while, the public could still believe in the dream. They could believe Dorothy Dandridge represented a new Hollywood, a modern Hollywood, a Hollywood ready to reward talent wherever it appeared. The photographs encouraged that belief. So did the Oscar nomination. So did the language of praise surrounding her beauty and presence. Everything about the surface suggested forward motion. But underneath, the industry was asking a colder question. What kind of roles could a woman like Dorothy Dandridge be allowed to play? Not what could she do. Not what did she deserve. Not what had she already proven. But what could America tolerate? That question followed her from film to film, from stage to stage, from one public triumph to the private worry behind it. It turned every opportunity into a test. It made every romantic possibility political. It made her beauty both a gift and a trap. Because once Hollywood placed Dorothy Dandridge in the center of desire, it had to face something it was not prepared to face. If she could be desired, then she could be loved. If she could be loved, then she could be kissed. If she could be kissed, then she could stand beside a white leading man not as decoration, but as an equal object of longing. And that was where the system began to pull back. The public image said she had arrived. The private reality was that she had arrived at a locked door. And the more gracefully Dorothy stood before that door, the more painful it became to see that Hollywood had no intention of handing her the key. Long before Hollywood called Dorothy Dandridge historic, she had already learned one of the cruelest lessons of show business. Applause does not always mean acceptance. That lesson followed her from the stage into the movies. It shaped the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she carried herself in rooms where admiration could turn into distance the moment the lights went down. For Dorothy, performance was never just performance. It was discipline. It was survival. It was a way of being seen without being fully welcomed. That is why her glamour mattered. Not because it was simply beautiful, but because it had been built under pressure. Every gesture had to be controlled. Every entrance had to be exact. Every public appearance had to prove, again and again, that she belonged in places that had never been designed for her. And that kind of proof takes something from a person. Hollywood liked to pretend stars were born in a flash. One right face, one right role, one right moment under the camera. But Dorothy Dandridge's image was not born overnight. It was shaped by years of performing before audiences who could applaud talent while still accepting segregation as normal. That contradiction did not disappear when she became famous. It followed her into better rooms. It followed her into studio meetings, publicity photographs, nightclubs, hotels, and film sets. The surroundings changed. The rules did not always change with them. This is the part of Dorothy's story that matters before the downfall. Because the tragedy was not waiting at the end. It was already inside the system that praised her. She was taught to be exceptional because ordinary access was not available. That is a heavy thing to ask of anyone. A white actress could be promising. Dorothy had to be extraordinary. A white actress could develop. Dorothy had to arrive fully formed. A white actress could be imperfect. Dorothy had to be polished enough to make prejudice look unreasonable. And even then, polish was not protection. It helped her enter the frame. It did not guarantee she could stay there. The public saw elegance, but elegance was not the same as ease. Behind that elegance was the constant negotiation of a woman who had to understand how she was being watched. Not only as an actress, not only as a singer, not only as a beauty, but as a black woman whose presence carried meaning before she had even spoken. That burden made every success double-edged. When Dorothy appeared glamorous, she expanded what Hollywood could imagine, but she also risked being trapped inside that glamour. When she appeared sensual, she broke through old limitations, but she also gave Hollywood a narrow box it could keep returning her to. When she appeared powerful, she became unforgettable. But power, for a black woman in that era, made the industry nervous. So the same qualities that made her a star also became the reasons Hollywood hesitated. This is why Carmen Jones Times was both a triumph and a warning. Dorothy did not simply play Carmen as a woman men desired. She made Carmen impossible to dismiss. There was intelligence behind the heat. There was control beneath the danger. She did not move like someone asking permission to be watched. She moved like someone who knew the screen belonged to her while she was on it. That was thrilling, and to Hollywood, it was also risky. Because once Dorothy Dandridge proved she could command the center of a film, the question became unavoidable. Why should she not remain there? Why should she not receive the next great role? Why should she not become a romantic lead? Why should she not stand beside the biggest male stars of her time? Why should her beauty be marketable only when it stayed within boundaries other people had drawn? Hollywood did not have an honest answer. So it offered another kind of answer: silence, hesitation, delay, fewer roles, narrower possibilities. That silence is often more revealing than an open refusal. It is easy to recognize a closed door when someone slams it. It is harder when the door opens just enough to make you believe the room is yours, then never opens any wider. Dorothy lived in that narrow opening, and the emotional cost of that position is easy to underestimate. From the outside, being the first can look like glory. The first nomination, the first breakthrough, the first face to cross a line. But being first also means standing alone in a space where no one has made the path safe yet. There is no map, no protection, no long line of earlier women whose careers prove the system will carry you if one film fails. No easy recovery if Hollywood decides you are too difficult, too risky, too much. For Dorothy Dandridge, one breakthrough had to do the work of an entire career, and that is an impossible demand. The public could look at her and see progress, but Dorothy had to live with the daily limits behind that image. She had to carry the hope of what she represented while fighting for the practical reality of work, money, roles, respect, and freedom. This is where the woman begins to separate from the symbol. The symbol is simple, the woman is not. The symbol says Dorothy Dandridge broke barriers. The woman had to wake up the next day and find out whether breaking a barrier actually meant anyone would let her pass through. And again, Hollywood gave her the same answer in different forms. Not yet, not that role, not that kind of love story, not beside that man, not for that audience, not in that market. Each refusal could be explained as business, as timing, as risk, as audience taste, as the way things were. But taken together, they formed a pattern. And the pattern was the prison. Dorothy Dandridge had been trained by life and by show business to make difficulty look graceful. But grace can hide exhaustion. Beauty can hide anger. A smile can hide the knowledge that the rules are changing much more slowly than the applause suggests. By the time Hollywood reached the subject it feared most, interracial desire, Dorothy was already standing at the center of a contradiction it had created. It had made her desirable. Now it had to decide how far that desire was allowed to go. By the late 1950s, Dorothy Dandridge had become the kind of star Hollywood could no longer pretend did not exist. But visibility was not the same as freedom. The question was no longer whether Dorothy could hold the screen. She had already done that. The question was whether Hollywood would allow her to hold the same kinds of stories white actresses were allowed to hold. A love story, a serious drama, a role where desire did not have to apologize for itself. That was where the industry began to hesitate, because Dorothy Dandridge's beauty had never been neutral in Hollywood's eyes. It was admired, photographed, marketed, and praised. But the moment that beauty moved toward a white man on screen, it became something the industry treated with caution. Not because Dorothy lacked grace, because America lacked courage. In Time's Island in the Sun, Dorothy appeared in a film built around racial tension, social boundaries, and the fear of forbidden relationships. The title itself sounded almost gentle, almost romantic, like a place of heat and escape. But beneath the surface was a question Hollywood rarely wanted to face directly. Who was allowed to love whom? And who had to remain only almost loved? The film became controversial. In parts of the American South, it faced bans, protests, and hostility. There were people who did not simply dislike the idea of interracial romance on screen. They treated it as an attack. That is the world Dorothy Dandridge was working inside. A world where the possibility of intimacy could become a public scandal. A world where a look could be dangerous. A world where a black woman standing near the center of romantic desire could unsettle more people than any villain ever could. This is why the idea of the kiss Hollywood feared matters. It is not just about one scene. It is about a boundary. Hollywood could dress Dorothy beautifully. It could light her face. It could promote her as glamorous and alluring. It could ask audiences to admire her. It could even allow men to desire her, as long as that desire remained controlled, coded, or safely contained. But the full language of romantic equality, the kiss, the embrace, the unquestioned place beside a white leading man was something else. That was the line, and Dorothy's career kept arriving at that line. The tragedy is not that she was invisible to the camera. The camera knew exactly what it had in her. It knew the charge she brought into a scene. It knew her face could change the temperature of a film. The problem was what came after the camera noticed. Because once Dorothy was seen as desirable, Hollywood had to decide whether that desire would be allowed to become a story. And too often, the answer was no. This is what made her situation so cruel. She was not being rejected because she could not perform the role of a leading lady. She was being restricted because she could perform it too well. Her elegance made the old rules look absurd. Her presence made the exclusions visible. Her beauty exposed the lie. If Dorothy Dandridge could stand in the frame with that much authority, then why should she not be given the same romantic possibilities, the same dramatic range, the same career expansion as the white stars around her? Hollywood did not want to answer that question honestly, so it turned the answer into caution. Not this market, not this pairing, not this storyline, not this much intimacy, not yet. And not yet can become a lifetime. The most revealing thing about Dorothy's career is how often the barrier appeared at the exact point where humanity should have begun. She could be a symbol, she could be a breakthrough. She could be a sensation, she could be a beautiful face on a poster. But to be simply loved on screen, without the whole weight of race, fear, and public reaction pressing down on the scene that remained almost impossible inside the Hollywood that had praised her. Then came Time's Tamango. Unlike the American studio system that had carefully managed and softened what it was willing to show, Tamango Times placed Dorothy in a story that went further. In that film, she shared what has been recorded as her first and only on-screen kiss with a white actor, and even that did not pass quietly. The film was controversial. Its American release was delayed. The kiss that should have been part of a performance became something larger than itself, because the culture around it refused to see it as only cinema. That is the strange cruelty of Dorothy Dandridge's screen life. She was asked to carry meaning even in the smallest gestures. A glance was not just a glance. A roll was not just a roll. A kiss was not just a kiss. Everything became evidence. Everything became a test of how far the industry, the censors, the exhibitors, and the audience were willing to move. And Dorothy had to keep standing there, graceful and exposed, while the world argued over whether she could be treated like a woman in a story. Not a problem, not a statement, not a threat. A woman. That is the emotional center of this chapter. Hollywood did not merely deny Dorothy Dandridge certain roles. It denied her the ordinary privacy of being fictional. White actresses could kiss, desire, betray, suffer, and return in another film. Their romantic scenes did not have to justify the future of a race. Their beauty did not become a referendum. Their desire did not become a public danger. Dorothy was not granted that ease. She had to be both actress and symbol, both performer and battleground. And symbols are rarely allowed to breathe. The more Hollywood praised her, the more it trapped her in a contradiction. It wanted the prestige of her breakthrough, but not the consequences of treating that breakthrough as real. It wanted to say Dorothy Dandridge had arrived, without rearranging the industry to make room for her arrival. So the door stayed half open, wide enough for applause, too narrow for a career. And after the controversy, after the hesitation, after the roles that almost came and the possibilities that never became reality, another truth began to emerge. Dorothy Dandridge had not run out of talent. Hollywood had run out of imagination. Once Hollywood runs out of imagination, it often calls the result fate. It tells the actor there are no roles. It tells the public the moment has passed. It tells history the career simply faded. But Dorothy Dandridge did not fade because the camera stopped loving her. She faded because the industry did not know how to keep writing for the woman it had already asked the world to admire. After Time's Carmen Jones, the question should have been simple. What comes next for a performer who has just become an Oscar nominee? For most actresses, an achievement like that becomes a bridge. It leads to better scripts, stronger directors, wider opportunities, more complicated characters. It tells studios that the actress has value. It gives her name weight in rooms where decisions are made. For Dorothy, it became something more fragile. A monument. Hollywood could point to her nomination as proof of progress. It could hold up her beauty, her performance, her historical place. It could say, look, the door is open, but a monument does not need a future. A career does. And Dorothy needed a career. She needed roles that did not reduce her to the same kind of heat, danger, or exotic fascination. She needed parts that allowed her to be ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. She needed to play women with flaws that were not punished by race, women with romance that did not become controversy, women whose existence did not have to explain an entire social order. Instead, she found herself facing the same wall in different costumes. There were not enough roles for a black leading lady because Hollywood had not built enough stories for one. And when roles involving black women did appear, even those were not guaranteed to reach her. The industry could be so distorted by its own prejudice that it sometimes preferred a white performer darkened into a role over a black actress with Dorothy Dandridge's talent. That is not just exclusion. It is erasure with the lights on, because by then, Dorothy had already proven the central lie false. She had proven a black woman could command desire on screen. She had proven glamour did not belong to one race. She had proven that audiences could look at her not as background, but as the center of the story, and still, the system retreated. This is the cruelty of being made into an exception. The exception is praised precisely because the rule remains intact. Dorothy could be celebrated as rare, singular, historic, while the machinery around her continued almost unchanged. The praise became another kind of trap. If she succeeded, she was exceptional. If she struggled, the system could pretend the experiment had failed. If she asked for more, she could be treated as difficult. If she accepted less, the industry could say there was no demand. There was no winning inside a structure built to keep the victory small. And so the public image continued to shine while the private reality became harder. Dorothy Dandridge still looked like a star. That was part of the heartbreak. The surface did not collapse quickly. She still had the poise, the face, the discipline, the kind of presence that could make a room rearrange itself around her. But the offers did not match the image. The work became less steady. The choices became narrower. The space between what she had proved and what she was given became wider. And in that space, a person can begin to disappear even while everyone still recognizes her name. This is what Hollywood rarely shows in its own legends, the slow violence of underuse, not the dramatic fall, not the scandalous headline, not the single event that explains everything, but the smaller humiliation of waiting, the meeting that leads nowhere, the script that never comes, the role that goes to someone safer, the industry smile that means no, the applause that does not become employment. For Dorothy, each closed door carried the weight of more than one career, because she was not only fighting for herself. Whether she wanted that burden or not, every decision made about her became part of a larger message about what black actresses could expect. That is a brutal position for an artist. Artists need room to fail. They need room to experiment, to choose badly, to recover, to surprise the public, to grow beyond the image that first made them famous. Dorothy was not given that room. Her image had to remain controlled because Hollywood had made her a symbol, but her humanity needed space because she was a woman, not a symbol. Between those two demands, something began to tighten. And then there was the stage. When film opportunities did not provide enough stability, Dorothy returned again and again to nightclub work. On stage, she could still command attention. She could still prove herself in real time. There was no editing room to shape her performance, no studio system to decide how much of her voice belonged in the final version, no film market to soften the meaning of her presence. But even there, triumph came with a bitter edge. In places like Las Vegas, she could perform for audiences who paid to see her, while the world around the performance still treated her as someone who did not fully belong. She could be welcomed under the spotlight and restricted outside of it. The room could applaud her, and the city could still remind her where the boundaries were. That contradiction followed her like a second shadow. On stage, she was Dorothy Dandridge, the star. Off stage, she was still a black woman moving through a segregated country. The distance between those two realities was not abstract. It shaped where she could stay, how she could move, how she was treated when the music ended. It turned performance into both escape and evidence. Every night, she could prove her brilliance. Every morning, the world could prove how little brilliance changed. And still, she kept working. That matters. Because stories like Dorothy's are often told as if tragedy made the choices for her. But she was not passive. She worked. She performed. She tried to hold a career together inside conditions designed to exhaust her. She carried private responsibilities while maintaining a public image that demanded beauty, calm, and control. Her daughter's care added another layer to that burden. The costs, the worry, the emotional strain, these were not things the public image could easily contain. A star is supposed to look weightless. Dorothy's life was becoming heavier, and Hollywood, which had once asked her to represent progress, did not offer enough shelter when progress became expensive. That is where the story grows quieter and more painful, because the collapse of a career is not always loud. Sometimes it is the slow realization that talent cannot protect you from a system that has already decided how small your future should be. Dorothy Dandridge had beauty. She had discipline. She had history. She had an Oscar nomination. But none of those things could force Hollywood to imagine her fully. And once a person has been seen incompletely for long enough, the damage does not stay professional. It becomes personal. It enters the rooms after the show. It follows the bills. It follows the silence. It follows the question no applause can answer. What happens to a woman who was told she had broken through, when the world on the other side still refuses to make room? The answer was not immediate. It came slowly. It came in the gap between the woman the public thought it knew and the woman who had to keep surviving after the cameras moved elsewhere. Dorothy Dandridge's story is often flattened into a familiar Hollywood shape. The rise, the breakthrough, the decline, the tragic ending. That shape is easy to understand. It gives the audience a clean arc. It lets the industry become background. It makes the fall look personal. But that is too simple. Dorothy Dandridge did not fall from a world that had fully welcomed her. She fell inside a world that had never decided where she could safely stand. That is the reframe her story demands. Her Oscar nomination was not the beginning of a new era for her career. It was proof of what she could do inside an era that still had no real plan for her. The nomination made history, but history did not pay the bills, raise a child, create scripts, soften prejudice, or protect a woman from being treated as a risk after she had already proven her worth. Hollywood had given Dorothy a title. It had not given her a structure. That difference can destroy a life quietly. A title says, "You are the first." A structure says, "You will not be the last." A title creates a headline. A structure creates a future. Dorothy Dandridge was handed the headline. The future remained uncertain. And this is where the cruelty becomes more intimate. Because once someone has been publicly celebrated, the world often assumes the hard part is over. The applause becomes evidence. The nomination becomes proof. The photographs become a kind of argument against pain. How could someone so admired still be trapped? But admiration is not freedom. Hollywood could admire Dorothy Dandridge and still fail her. Audiences could applaud her and still live inside a culture that limited her. Critics could praise her and still belong to an industry unable to imagine enough roles for her to continue. This is why the later years hurt differently. They were not simply the years after fame. They were the years after a promise. A promise that the door had opened. A promise that talent would be enough. A promise that history had changed because one woman had reached a room no black woman had reached before. But the promise did not hold. Dorothy kept working, because that is what performers do when the dream becomes unstable. They return to the stage, they accept the booking, they put the gown on, they step into the light. They give the room what it came to see, even when the room has no idea what it costs to keep appearing effortless. There is something almost unbearable about that kind of performance. Not because the stage is false. Sometimes the stage may have been the place where Dorothy had the most direct power. On stage, she did not need a studio to decide whether she belonged in the final cut. She could command the audience in real time. She could remind people, night after night, that the talent had not disappeared. But after the applause, the old world waited. The same country that could pay to watch her sing could still restrict where she stayed. The same city that could advertise her name could still treat her as separate once the performance ended. The same audience that admired her elegance could return home without questioning the system that made that elegance so expensive. That is the private reality behind the public image. Dorothy Dandridge had to keep proving something that should have been settled. She had to prove she was bankable, prove she was refined, prove she was desirable but not too threatening, prove she was serious but not too demanding, prove she could carry history without asking history to carry her back. No artist should have to live that way. And yet, for Dorothy, the demand was constant. The world wanted her to be graceful about barriers that were not graceful at all. It wanted her to remain beautiful while opportunities shrank. It wanted her to keep the image polished, even as the life behind it grew more difficult. This is where the symbol and the woman began to pull in opposite directions. The symbol had to remain shining. The woman needed rest. The symbol could be placed in articles, retrospectives, photographs, and firsts. The woman had to face the ordinary terror of bills, work, family, reputation, health, aging, and uncertainty. The symbol could survive on admiration, The woman could not. Her daughter's care made the burden heavier still. Dorothy was not only carrying a career inside a hostile industry, she was carrying a private responsibility the public could not see in full. The cost of care, the emotional strain, the fear of not being able to provide these were not cinematic details. They were daily pressures. And pressure has a way of finding every crack. The tragedy is not that Dorothy Dandridge was weak. The tragedy is that she had to be strong for too long in a system that kept calling strength opportunity. By the early 1960s, the distance between what she had represented and what she was living had become painfully wide. She remained a name of historic importance, but importance is not the same as security. She remained beautiful, but beauty could not reopen a closed industry. She remained talented, but talent had already made its case. That is perhaps the most painful truth. Dorothy did not need to prove herself again. Hollywood needed to prove it had changed, and it had not changed enough. So when people look back and ask what went wrong, the answer cannot be reduced to one choice. One relationship, one film, one disappointment, or one final day. Those things matter, but they do not explain the whole wound. The wound was larger. It was the exhaustion of being exceptional in a world that refused to become fair. It was the loneliness of being turned into a milestone without being given a road. It was the humiliation of knowing the camera could love you, while the industry behind the camera remained afraid of what that love implied. This is why Dorothy Dandridge's story still unsettles. Because it asks a question Hollywood would rather avoid. What does recognition mean if it does not lead to power? What does a breakthrough mean if the person who breaks through is left standing alone? And what happens when a woman becomes proof of progress before progress is ready to protect her? Dorothy's life forces us to see that being first is not always a crown. Sometimes, it is a burden handed to the one person with the least protection. And by the time the world began to understand the weight of what she had carried, Dorothy Dandridge was already moving toward the final and quietest chapter of her life. A chapter too often treated as the whole story, when it was really the aftermath of everything Hollywood had refused to face. The final chapter of Dorothy Dandridge's life is often told too quickly. A date, an apartment, a death at 42. A tragic ending placed neatly at the bottom of a remarkable career. But to rush there is to misunderstand the story. Because the end of Dorothy Dandridge's life was not the beginning of the tragedy. It was the echo of a tragedy that had been building for years. Quietly. Beneath glamour. Beneath applause. Beneath the language of historic achievement. By the mid-1960s, the world that had once seemed ready to celebrate her had become smaller. The film roles had not grown into the career her talent deserved. The industry had changed in some ways, but not enough, not fast enough, not in time for her. And time matters in a life like Dorothy's. History can correct itself later. A culture can apologize later. A new generation can rediscover a forgotten star later. But a person has to live in the years they are given. Dorothy Dandridge had to live inside the years before Hollywood knew how to honor her fully. She had to fight for space before the door had been widened. She had to carry the weight of being first without the protection that later generations might receive from her example. That is what makes her final years so difficult to look at directly. Not because they reduce her to sadness, but because they reveal the cost of being celebrated without being sustained. There were professional disappointments. There were financial pressures. There were private burdens. There was the continuing responsibility of her daughter's care, a responsibility that had followed her through the public years and into the quieter ones. There was the exhausting work of remaining recognizable, while the industry's attention moved elsewhere. A star can disappear from screens long before the public stops knowing her name. That kind of disappearance is especially cruel. It leaves the image alive while the opportunities die around it. People remember the face. They remember the breakthrough. They remember the glamorous photographs. But the woman behind those images still needs work, still needs money, still needs stability, still needs rest. Dorothy did not get enough of any of them. And because she had once stood so close to greatness, every later struggle was made to look sharper by comparison. The distance between Oscar history and personal difficulty became part of the pain. She had not imagined greatness from far away. She had touched it. She had sat inside it. She had been named among the best actresses of her year. And then she had to keep explaining, through her life, that recognition had not saved her. This is where the public often makes a mistake. It assumes a breakthrough is a rescue. It assumes the nomination protects the nominee. It assumes the photograph proves the life. It assumes visibility creates safety. Dorothy's story tells us otherwise. Visibility can make a person more exposed. A breakthrough can make a person more alone. Being first can mean there is no one ahead of you to show the way, and no one beside you who fully understands the pressure. By the time Dorothy died in 1965, even the facts surrounding the cause of her death had been discussed through more than one account. Some sources have pointed to medication, others have pointed to a medical complication connected to an injury. But the important thing is not to turn her death into a puzzle. Dorothy Dandridge was not a mystery to be solved. She was a life to be understood. And understanding her means resisting the temptation to let the final day swallow everything that came before it. Because if her story becomes only the tragic death of a Hollywood star, then Hollywood escapes too easily. The system becomes scenery. The barriers become mood. The discrimination becomes atmosphere instead of structure. But Dorothy's life was shaped by structure, by who was allowed to play what, by who was allowed to love whom on screen, by which actresses were considered safe, by which bodies were marketable and which were threatening, by which breakthroughs were celebrated as symbols, then left unsupported as careers. Her ending cannot be separated from those forces, but it also should not erase her. Dorothy Dandridge was not only what happened to her. She was not only the closed doors, not only the lost roles, not only the headlines that came after the promise faded. She was a performer of discipline and heat. A woman who understood the camera, a presence that made Hollywood's limitations visible simply by exceeding them. A star who forced the industry to confront a question it was not ready to answer. If this woman has everything a leading lady needs, why is she not being allowed to become one? That question did not die with her. It waited. It waited in the careers of black actresses who came after her. It waited in the award seasons where progress still moved slowly. It waited in the memory of audiences who would later look back and realize that Dorothy Dandridge had not merely been ahead of her time, she had been held back by it. There is a difference. To say someone was ahead of her time can sound almost gentle, as if time was simply not ready. But time is made by people. Industries are made by people. Decisions are made by people sitting in rooms, choosing which stories to finance, which risks to avoid, which performers to trust with a future. Dorothy Dandridge's time did not fail her by accident. Hollywood chose caution again and again. And the cost of that caution was a woman's career, a woman's stability, a woman's chance to build upon the very history she had helped create. Still, the story does not end only in loss. Because even when Hollywood failed to give Dorothy the future she deserved, it could not erase the mark she left behind. The nomination remained. The image remained. The performance remained. The question remained. And decades later, when another black actress stood on the Oscar stage and spoke Dorothy Dandridge's name, the unfinished meaning of Dorothy's life returned with force. Not as nostalgia, as evidence. Evidence that some doors are opened long before the people inside are ready to welcome the person standing there. Dorothy Dandridge had stood at that door, and the world would spend years learning how much it had cost her to stand there alone. Dorothy Dandridge did not live to see the world fully understand her. That is one of the quietest cruelties of her legacy. Recognition came, but much of it came late. The kind of recognition that looks back with tenderness. The kind that says the industry should have done better. The kind that places a name in retrospectives, tributes, documentaries, and speeches, long after the person herself no longer needs applause. Hollywood is very good at honoring people after the cost has already been paid. Dorothy's name became a symbol, a first, a milestone, a woman whose image could be brought forward whenever the industry wanted to remember its progress and its failures at the same time. But a legacy is not the same as a life. A legacy can be polished. A life is lived under pressure. And Dorothy Dandridge lived under pressures that the word pioneer can sometimes hide. Pioneer sounds noble. It sounds heroic. It suggests courage, movement, and destiny. But it can also soften the violence of what it means to be first in a place that does not truly want to change. Being first meant Dorothy had to stand where no one had stood before, without the comfort of knowing the floor would hold. It meant every choice carried more meaning than it should have. Every role mattered too much. Every refusal echoed too widely. Every romantic scene had to pass through a culture terrified of what it might imply. She could not simply be a movie star. She had to be proof. Proof that a black woman could be glamorous. Proof that a black woman could be sensual. Proof that a black woman could carry desire, danger, elegance, and drama. Proof that the camera could love her as fiercely as it loved anyone else. And she gave that proof. Again and again. The tragedy is that proof was never the problem. Dorothy Dandridge proved enough. Hollywood simply did not change enough to meet the proof. That is why her story still hurts. It is not frozen in the 1950s. It reaches forward. It asks what happens when an industry celebrates a breakthrough but does not build a future around it. It asks what kind of burden falls on the person who becomes a symbol before she is protected as a human being. Decades later, when Halle Berry won the Academy Award for Best Actress, Dorothy's name returned to the room, not as a footnote, not as a forgotten photograph, but as part of a lineage that had taken far too long to become visible. That moment did not repair what Dorothy lost. Nothing could. But it did reveal something important. Dorothy Dandridge had not disappeared. She had been waiting inside the history Hollywood was finally learning how to speak aloud. And when her name is spoken now, the temptation is to make her story inspirational. It is inspirational, in part, but it is also an indictment. Because Dorothy did not simply open a door. She stood before it while the people on the other side debated whether she was allowed to enter. She smiled for cameras while the walls remained in place. She carried the glamour of a star and the loneliness of an exception. That is not a simple triumph. It is not a simple tragedy either. It is something more uncomfortable. A life that proves talent can be undeniable and still not be enough. A life that proves visibility can be historic and still not be freedom. A life that proves Hollywood can recognize beauty, profit from it, celebrate it, nominate it, and still fail the woman who carried it. Dorothy Dandridge once stood close enough to history that the world could see her. The Oscar nomination made sure of that. But history did not save her from the present she had to live through. It did not give her the roles that should have followed. It did not make the industry brave. It did not turn applause into protection. So, perhaps the most honest way to remember her is not only as the first black woman nominated for Best Actress. That is true, but it is not enough. She should also be remembered as the woman who exposed the difference between being welcomed as a symbol and being accepted as an equal. Hollywood wanted the image of Dorothy Dandridge. The image was elegant. The image was useful. The image could be framed, praised, remembered, but the woman needed more than an image could give her. She needed room. Room to love on screen without controversy swallowing the scene. Room to fail without confirming prejudice. Room to age, change, choose, recover, and continue. Room to be more than the beautiful exception standing at the edge of someone else's courage. That room did not come in time, and so the story ends quietly, not because the pain is small, but because the truth is too heavy for noise. Dorothy Dandridge did not lack the qualities of a leading lady. She had the beauty, she had the discipline, she had the presence, she had the history. What she did not have was an industry willing to imagine her future as fully as it admired her face. And that is the wound Hollywood left behind. Not just the lost films, not just the closed doors. Not just the kiss that became too dangerous for a frightened culture to treat as cinema. The wound is the knowledge that Dorothy Dandridge was not invisible. She was seen, and still, she was not given enough room to live inside what everyone had already seen.